He is totally a product of the Afghani war. The CIA has admitted it, and he's accepted it, that he was trained and encouraged by the CIA during, the early 80s. He is made for the era of television. Heroes were bigger than life, and he did not come bigger than Osama bin Laden.
Apart from the heroes they created, the Mujahideen had another secret weapon: their faith. For the holy warrior, death in battle is an honor, life is a sacrifice, and the reward is paradise.
Faith. Faith in victory, faith in personal redemption, faith in the positive consequences of individual sacrifice was a very major motivating factor in making the Afghans fight in a way that the Soviet recruits could not fight.
But faith was fighting a Soviet superpower, and inevitably the roll call of martyrs grew. Then, in 1986, American support arrived in the shape of Milt Bearden, the first CIA man to conduct missions inside Afghanistan.
By the time I arrived on the scene, we're talking about 1 million dead, maybe 1.5 million had been wounded, and Iran and Pakistan were just overloaded, jammed with refugees driven out of Afghanistan. So I was confronted with the sights and sounds of a situation like that, and it allowed one not to have any reservations about what we were doing.
And what they were doing amounted to a major escalation of US involvement. Milt Bearden was brought in to teach the Mujahideen fighters how to use the Stinger missile.
Up until 1986, all of the weaponry that we had provided to the Afghan Mujahideen was Warsaw Pact. And the Stinger was apple pie. It was red, white, and blue, American. The Stinger is fire and forget. They know that there is a movement of helicopters coming from Kabul, and they're waiting for them. They come in, they turn on their Stingers, and the first gunner fires. It just flies across the sky with that big white plume behind it, and it hits the first helicopter, brings it immediately to the ground right beside the runway of this airfield, and then they get 2 and 3, just in quick succession. They come all down, and it turned the war around.
The relentless war in Afghanistan lasted 10 long years, with the loss of 15,000 Russian lives and over 1 million Afghani lives. The once mighty Soviet army were humbled, defeated, and sent home in 1989. This had proved to be, as Brzezinski had hoped it would, Russia's Vietnam.
I felt good when the Soviets retreated across that river. I felt really good. I felt that the effort was not in vain, and that this was also the beginning of something much greater, namely that the retreat across the river from Afghanistan was not just a retreat from Afghanistan. It was the beginning of something much bigger that we saw subsequently.
In fact, it seems the defeat at the hands of the Afghan Mujahideen was the beginning of the end of the great Soviet Empire.
As the Soviets withdrew their army from Afghanistan, very sharp notice of that was taken by the people of Hungary, Poland, and East Germany. And I think they were emboldened to do what they did throughout the summer of 1989, when the Hungarians were the first to see clearly that the Soviets could not move against them again as they did in 1956, and they cut their wire with the Austrian border, on the Austrian border, and opened up the Iron Curtain the first time. I think the Poles found that they weren't going to have anybody move in with Russian tanks after that exhausting battle, and they had an election in June of 1989 that kicked out communism once and for all and brought in that little electrician from Gdansk, and solidarity wins. And I think the East German people who were out in the streets all through the summer, first in tentative numbers of a few thousand, and then up to 500,000 in Leipzig, or 1 million, they also felt that they could do this because the Soviets simply weren't coming this time.
America was mesmerized by the collapse of communism and what they saw as the triumph of democracy. But Afghanistan, the land where the Soviet superpower had first been defeated, lay in ruins. Up to 2/3 of its population had become refugees.
The greatest mistake that was made by the United States during that period of the Afghan war and thereafter was that once we had won the war, or I should say the Afghans won the war with our help, we walked away. We walked away and we left it to Pakistan and we left it to Saudi Arabia to try to rebuild the area and to reestablish civil order in Afghanistan and tried to bring the region out of this conflict. That was a terrible mistake.
The Americans walked away from Afghanistan, leaving the Mujahideen feeling betrayed. At the end of the Afghan war, many were deported back to their own countries. Some were arrested on arrival, some executed. They now posed a threat.
They were taught skills from how to garrote a man with a wire from behind, how to capture a village with just 2 or 3 people, how to blow up a railway line, how to sabotage an oil refinery. Nobody seems to have foreseen the consequences of training and arming all these young men, many of whom had no other professional skill or interest in life, to be very fierce fighters and, if you like, terrorists.
We spent billions of pounds fighting the Cold War, and it was Osama bin Laden and his people in Afghanistan who fought our war, who gave million people who gave life to fight communism in Afghanistan. That's what we need to remember, that those million people sacrificed their lives for the West to destroy Soviet Union. And it suited us to have Osama bin Laden building roads and building hospitals, who became a hero. He became a symbol of jihad and mujahideen.
The holy warriors were now on the run as international fugitives. As they shifted their attention from communism to the struggles raging in the Muslim world, they found a new cause. But as they spoke the language of jihad against what they saw as oppressive regimes, their uncompromising demands for change were not welcome.
What they were fighting in Afghanistan for had the support, for instance, of Washington, London and Paris. The same thing, once they started to fight it in their own Muslim countries, were not acceptable. So suddenly they turned, they found themselves from being heroes, they were being villains. From being mujahid, they were now terrorists. A lot of them have been jailed and some of them killed in the Muslim countries. And then in a way they became not soldiers of fortune, but roaming soldiers of Allah. We end up finding them in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in Chechnya, and Kashmir. In some of them managed to get into Palestine, and also in the Yemen and other trouble spots in the Muslim world.
The arms supplied during the Afghan jihad were not recovered, and the facilities set up during the war, religious schools, training camps, the nursery slopes for the Mujahideen, had matured into what were soon being described as schools of terrorism. Men from over 40 countries were to come to Afghanistan as it became known as the global center for the Mujahideen to train and prepare for jihads elsewhere.
It created a role model for a lot of young people who, because they're living in this political environment which are very oppressive in the Muslim world, who've tried everything, democracy, who've tried everything, but it does not work. So they thought the only way that real change can come anywhere is perhaps by taking up arms and confronting the enemy on the battlefield.
On the plains of Afghanistan, when we armed these Mujahideen fighters, one lesson we learned then was that